Dr. Hans Utter, welcome back to the Gnostic Media Podcast for your 8th time, and this is part 7 of Music, Mind Control, and Psychobiology, and you had come up with a subtitle for this episode, and we probably should have given subtitles to all of the previous episodes, but this one's subtitle is Electronic Warfare, Psychotronics, and Mass Culture. And so welcome back, Hans. I'm happy you're back and ready to knock out this last part. And one more point I should say before you begin is we've decided to make the FM radio thing separate and not part of this. I know I've been saying it's coming for like 6 or 7 episodes, but anyway, you'll have to wait and we'll get that done also. So anyway, pass it over to you, Hans.
Yeah, just about the FM radio. I was listening to it again because I pulled out all the clips, and I realized that there is so much there in terms of the actual distribution angle of not only putting the music out, but setting up all the clubs, setting up the entire system, basically, in which 60s rock kind of flourished, but really behind the scenes. So these are direct quotes. Interviews with all these major players, and a lot of them are not well known. And I realized, well, you know what, I can just play these clips and say this is radio producer so and so. But I really felt that it would be a lot better to go into the details because, in some ways, this may really be even more important than I initially surmised. So, but I think it is kind of a little bit separate, but it's definitely certainly interrelated, and it's a great interview in the way that it's being done in such a positive way. Let's look at the 60s, and the negative connotation is that, this music has been commercialized. We don't have the freedom of the FM radio. At the same time, you've got people directly admitting what we're doing is programming, right? But then the people that were behind setting it up, I thought, well, I want to know who these people are. I want to know more about them. So anyways, we'll look forward to hitting that. And before we start out with the basic lecture, just wanted to go through again, because I think all these things tie together. And so people that initially were wondering, where are all the references? Well, there's so many references. As you'll see today, I threw together just a smattering of the hundreds of references, or even thousands that I have. But just to start out, I wanted just to go over again some of the mind control, or not say mind control, but behavior influence, the different categories I came up with in the beginning. And I think this lecture is going to kind of tie things together, because we're going to look at not only the psychological aspect, a little bit on the quote-unquote occult aspect, but also look at some actual defense documents and John Lilly and some other things, and just kind of see how all these things really can possibly operate together. And again, I'm not stating that when I show a defense psyops document that I'm stating that this particular genre of music is a psyop, but I'm showing you how these things are planned and implemented, and so people can kind of come to their own conclusions. But anyways, in terms of that, just some of the categories for the music and mind control, I talked about. The first one was behavioral conformity, okay? And so we have to look at this mass psychological aspect, not the individual, but also the mass psychological aspect, how it creates in-group conformity, but also creates a agreed upon behavioral system, and it can create, we call it counterculture. It creates its own sort of offspring from the mainstream culture. Manipulation and persuasion, we'll look at some of that as well, but we're going to look at a little more directly with like particular technologies that relate to that. defining and reinforcing social identity, of course, marking and constructing social group boundaries, sorting people into groups. Again, when you have a genre, you construct the audience, right? That's one thing that Adorno talked about back with the radio project, because you construct the audiences, right? You're not only creating people in the groups, but you're helping to create those groups through the media. Group level coordination, like entrainment, we talked about that. Emotional manipulation, expression, conflict resolution, and then finally cultural narratives. So we'll touch on a little bit on all these aspects, but then again, I want to let people to know that this broad outline I started this whole series with Jan with is still in play. And so hopefully we're not going to go back and cover all the other things we've covered, but hopefully people can go back and listen to other episodes if they remember what they've listened to. If they're not taking too much Paxil and they remember. And then we'll go over that. But all right, Jan, let's go ahead and get started then.
All right, well, let's dive right into Aldous Huxley. And what I want to do before I have you dive into that is ask you, in your opinion, what is the biggest obstacle to people understanding the depth and gravitas of Aldous Huxley's involvement in MKUltra and mind control, etc.?
Well, there's a couple things. One of them is that he is certainly one of the major icons, literary icons, an icon of the counterculture in a certain way in terms of freeing up people from restrictions of consciousness, varieties of religious experience, all that stuff, looking at different modes of opening the mind. I think the main thing is that he's very positively valenced in that he supposedly or appears to be talking against all of these programs, right? He sort of represents a contrary voice. So not only have the cultural, Bourdieu says, the cultural capital associated with Huxley, right? Huxley is a great genius, a great writer, a great scientist, great humanitarian. But then you have the fact that he is, in fact, these quotes is ostensibly he's actually talking against these procedures. So I think it's kind of hard for people to understand. There's a sort of a cognitive dissonance there, where somebody that seems to be helping to free people is actually part of creating those mechanisms of control. So I think those are the two primary vector points for that.
All right, Hans, let's get into the quotes from Aldous Huxley. And I know you've got some good ones here, and one of them is similar to one that I've talked about a number of times and quoted, but a little bit different. So let's dive into those. Okay.
Yeah, and this is what I would describe. In the beginning, we talked about psychobiology. So this is some of the underpinnings what could be described as a psychobiological control grid. So this is Huxley's lecture given at the Tavistock Group, California Medical School, 1961. Quote, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution."
Today, we are faced, I think, with the approach of what may be called the ultimate revolution, the final revolution, where man can act directly on the mind-body of his fellows. Well, needless to say, some kind of direct action on human mind-bodies has been going on since the beginning of time. But this has generally been of a violent nature. The techniques of terrorism have been known from time immemorial, and people have employed them with more or less ingenuity, sometimes with the utmost crudity, sometimes with a good deal of skill acquired by a process of trial and error, finding out what the best ways of using torture, imprisonment, constraints of various kinds. But as I think it was Metternich said many years ago, you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you are going to control any population for any length of time, you must have some measure of consent. It's exceedingly difficult to see how pure terrorism can function indefinitely. It can function for a fairly long time, but I think sooner or later you have to bring in an element of persuasion, an element of getting people to consent to what is happening to them. Well, it seems to me that the nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and presumably always will exist, to get people actually to love their servitude. This is seems to me the ultimate in malevolent revolution, shall we say. And this is a problem which has interested me for many years, and about which I wrote 30 years ago a fable, The Brave New World, which is essentially the account of a society making use of all the devices at that time available, and some of the devices which I imagined to be possible, making use of them in order to, first of all, to standardize the population, to iron out inconvenient human differences, to create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
So,
yeah, and of course Aldous Huxley doesn't talk about that he was heading that final revolution.
yeah. And let me just continue from the same lecture, another nice morsel.
Okay.
Quote, and let me talk about a little bit about the improvement in the techniques of terrorism. I think there have been improvements. Pavlov, after all, made some extremely profound observations, both on animals and human beings. And he found, among other things, that the conditioning techniques applied to animals or humans in a state either of psychological or physical stress sank in, so to say, very deeply into the mind body of the creature and were extremely difficult to get rid of, that they seem to be embedded more deeply than other forms of conditioning. And we'll
now,
get it.
Is this actually from his talk, The Final Revolution?
Yeah.
Okay, because I did play this as as episode 3 of my RBN show there, so people can check that out and hear his whole lecture. And in there, I intersperse, break it up with points regarding his talk and his background and everything. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's an important thing I want to mention is the physical stress going deeply into the mind body of the organism, right? So what we're getting into today a little bit is more the deep conditioning aspect. And again, people might want to review the psychological stuff I covered last time, but this is a very, very important point. And especially we talk about meta-programs and meta-programming the human biocomputer. We'll see these meta-programs which are invisible and unconscious a little bit later on with John Lilly. So just hope people keep that point in mind. And let me just move on with a nice little Bertrand Russell quote from The Influence of Science and Society to set the stage. In like manner, the scientific rulers will provide one kind of education for ordinary men and women, and another for those who are to become holders of scientific power. Ordinary men and women will be expected to be docile, industrious, punctual, thoughtless, and contented. Of these qualities, probably contentment will be considered the most important. In order to produce it, all the researches of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and biochemistry will be brought into play. All the boys and girls will learn from an early age what it is to be cooperative, i.e., to do exactly what everybody is doing. Initiative will be discouraged in these children, and insubordination without being punished will be scientifically trained out of them. And a little further on, quote, it is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments more control over individual mentality than they have now, even in totalitarian countries. Fitch laid down that education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished.
And we do see that happening all over the place with education like Common Core, etc.
Yep. Well, certainly. And, you know, the one thing is that as we, you know, as we're in this particular state in history, even a lot of the stuff, you know, maybe 5-10 years ago may have been unbelievable, but I think anybody who's not completely anesthetized should be aware that things have reached a pretty far point in terms of, at least in terms of the mass mind being conditioned. And, you know, it's such a thing that I was listening to hip hop on the radio. I had to buy a new car, whole long story, which I've told Jan about, but and I was listening to the hip hop, and even from when I listened to it 2 months ago, it's even reduced to the point of like it's not even English. There's not even any music there. It's unbelievable. I mean, I've even seen the de-evolution of hip hop just in the course of doing these interviews to even a place where I'm like, wow, I can't even believe that this is even on the radio. I mean, and I give examples of that, but I mean, certainly things are accelerating, at least for those who are entrained in these processes, and people that aren't. It's definitely time to get out of the little treadmill and your little.
Well, not only that, but maybe send this to 20 or 30 of your friends, every one of you who listens to this, and help them out of all of this. And it doesn't matter if they're listening to hip hop or heavy metal or whatever. You know, people need to understand this information. And sorry, it's 20 hours, folks, but, we had to present this information well and thoroughly so that you understand it, so that we could understand it. And, you know, it's a lot of research and a lot of material going through this on the way. So that's how it is.
Yeah, and it is a pretty broad and vast subject.
And sound bites, I think, speaking of, sound bites are kind of what got them into this mess in the first place. So maybe they need to start focusing on real research rather than looking for sound bites. Can you give me the 2-minute synopsis of Hans and Jan's series?
Yeah, possibly, but we could try.
Dude, you gotta listen to it, man. It's gonna change everything. It's going to be like a DMT trip. That'll get them to listen.
Hey, exactly, man. In fact, I'm on DMT right now. Yeah. That would be funny.
I'll see you back in about 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, let's move on to the next point here. And this kind of ties in with what I went into the last part of this, and this is kind of the early brain behavior research. So again, when you have this model, right, you have a model, as Descartes said, that animals are just like little automatons. They don't think, they're just like little robots, and I think all of this, anybody who's had a pet, or you see animals, they may have limited cognitive abilities, but they certainly have emotions and emotional experiences, and they exhibit emotions, they have egos. So that shows this kind of mechanistic model, but a lot of these studies
and be careful of that Freudian term ego. I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, well, ego meaning they have a sense of themselves as separate from the environment and as actors in the environment. At least dogs, some other things so they do think of their own self-interests, and whether those are totally conditioned or not, they do. They're aware of other forces around them and aware of their own agenda, so to speak, especially dogs. So, but all right. So in terms of the early brain research, behavioral research, there's a number of different schools. You have the Sekhanov-Pavlov School of Reflexology in Russia. Again, that's not reflexology as in the treatment of pressure points, but reflexology as in the conditioned behavioral response network. The Ethology Animal Behavior School of Heinroth Lorenz in Timburg in Western Europe. You have the Behaviorist School of Thorndike, Jennings, Watson, and Skinner in America. So, of course, B.F. Skinner.
Well, and again, that goes back to the group at Harvard under and working with Henry A. Murray that we were talking about in the last episode.
Yeah. And then we also have some studies of reflex activities by Sheridan in England, and Magnus in the Netherlands. And so all these people were working from a similar model, a similar research paradigm, and also a similar descriptive and fundamental sort of reductionist approach to human cognition experience. So the basic tenets of this research are, number one, motor activities should be recorded and observed in objective terms, avoiding all subjective psychological interpretations. And that's also, you look at phenomenology, I think that's, I've mentioned that briefly, and if we ever do an episode of, countermeasures, I think that starting to be aware of your actual experiences in sort of a foundational plane to try to get in touch with your actual sensations is very important in terms of breaking out of this, but it also shows that they really tried to work from actual behavior. And then number two, all behaviors due to the physical and chemical activity of sense organs, neurons, and muscles. Interpretations of behavior that depended on the activities of a non-material mind or psyche were ruled inadmissible. Okay, so this is kind of the foundation point of the mechanistic kind of behaviorist model that served pretty well, and certainly, as we mentioned before, certainly has powerful effects on certain types of behavior. But another thing that they did work on quite a bit was understanding even seemingly unconscious or insignificant behaviors, right? So you're observing entire streams of behavior, and there may be, if you have like a tick, if I go like, and I, but that tick or that one behavior may be tied to an entirely deep psychological process. So from some of that research, you start to understand cues and understand also neurological connections of specific movements or sensory reactions that are actually cued with other systems. But this is from the book, The Evolving Brain, the Mind and Neuronal Control of Behavior. But it's kind of a good summary of looking at that behaviorist school. And so, but as we move on, unfortunately, you could say they didn't leave it with that. I mean, there's always been these other elements that we're going to dive into right now and look at certain ways that sound or other types of things are directly affecting the organism, but are affecting it possibly on a much deeper level than just hooking up electrodes to people when they have to go to the bathroom or something. So we can move on from there.
Sure. This is number 6?
Yes. So,
all right.
So undetectable. So we look at the fact that it's possible that forces can be affecting us without our awareness. And that's one of the things that, I want to call people's attention to, especially in terms of things like music festivals or even watching television or other types of media, that there are a lot of technologies that have been out for a long time that can possibly influence people. And we'll go in that little more detail and look at some rock concerts, or other places where it's possible that some kind of technology has been deployed, or combination of things, right? So undetectable neuronal phase locking. And that is, we talked about entrainment quite a bit, but that is where particular frequencies are utilized to produce psychological effects in people that 95% of the people are not even aware that are occurring. And this is just from a study done by a scientist that looked at the use of 6 to 10 hertz ELF. That's extremely low frequencies on brain waves. These are things you cannot hear. These are things that are completely undetectable. in terms of your own hearing mechanism. But I may have mentioned before, but there's certain types of sounds that even people that are deaf can perceive, right? So there's sounds that can be perceived in your nervous system. And so in this case, I'm just going to read some of the results of this study where people were basically given a certain amount of these little dosage of these frequencies. Quote, subjects' verbatim reports were quite revealing. Keep in mind that none of the subjects actually said they felt the ELFs. The most common verbatim reports occurred between 8.6 and 9.6 hertz. Common statements were subtle, tingling sensations in the fingers, arms, legs, and teeth, and roof of the mouth. 2 subjects reported a metallic feeling in their mouth. 1 subject reported a tightness in the chest, and another subject reported a tightness in the stomach. Several subjects also reported sensations when the ELF frequency was between 6 and 7 hertz. The verbatim responses in this range were ringing in the ears, flushed face, fatigued, tightening in the chest, and increased pulse. So this is from a study, again, and there's many, many other studies done, and there's also a lot of studies that are classified. So this guy's kind of an independent scientist, but he's followed the whole protocol. So that's just an example of the use of brainwave frequencies. And so what we talk about as infrasonic sound or ultrasound. And if you look at, for example, if you're at a techno rave, you're listening to, super sub bass hip hop, whether it uses binaural beats, and again, binaural beats is when you have 2 different frequencies, left and right ears, and they cancel out and your brain hears those frequencies, or else if you're able to embed frequencies, obviously your average speaker system cannot play ELF frequencies. You don't have that kind of frequency response in your speakers at home. But if you're in a larger venue, other kinds of places, it's very easy to deploy these frequencies, this infrasonic sound. And this really relates to different vibrational frequencies of the brain, which is next slide here. So anyways, the basic frequency responses of the brain, we have 1.3 delta waves, 1.1 to 3 hertz, and that's associated with deep sleep. 4 to 7 hertz theta waves associated with REM sleep and deep relaxation. 8 to 14 hertz alpha waves associated with light relaxation and meditation. 15 to 30 hertz beta waves associated with fully awake state. And this is actually, I put that in there. This is going to go tie into the photic driving. So you can use actually light frequency to induce these different altered types of brainwave patterns and responses, and then 31 plus hertz. And there's some different arrays of these schematics. I mean, some people are going to say that alpha starts from 8 or starts from 7, et cetera. But these are the rough frequency ranges. And the beta wave brainwaves, again, are associated with your conscious awakening functioning. And some of these deeper brainwave states can be accessed, and an important aspect of that is what's known as a twilight state, right? So the twilight state is where you're in an extremely receptive place. This is also described as, where you get hypnagogic imagery, you're about to fall asleep and you start seeing various things pop up in your mind, or daydreaming. It's an example of that, which can be very good for creativity, but it's also very good for mental programming, right? It's also very good to embed or, sort of access different parts of the mind. And then again, some of these different states, producing deep sleep. Some of these things can be accessed at different points. So you can have a 3 hertz delta wave going that's going to kind of put people almost into a deep sleep type of trance with other types of stimulations going at the same time. And again, a lot of times these, at least in terms of sound, these are not detectable. They are, so to speak, invisible effects. And this is also, though, you have to understand, this is our interaction with our environment, right? So our eyes and ears, our tactile sensations, every kinesthetic sensations, olfactory, etc., taste sensations. This is how our mind directly brings the world to us and how we compute, or so to speak, register the world and create our experiential environment. So a lot of different things can cause these rhythms to entrain, not only music itself, frequencies, light frequencies, but other types of rhythms, right, can also set up these types of entrainment responses.
All right, so let's see. Where are we at now? Is it photic driving?
Photic driving. Yeah, and Jan, you feel free to just chime in with whatever. I guess I got this because I've got the PowerPoint. I'm kind of like blasting through it. So if you want,
well, that's all right, because it's kind of a summary or a conclusion of everything, pulling everything in the prior 6 episodes together. So
okay, cool. But yeah, feel free to jump in if you want to talk about rock concerts or experiences you've had or whatever. It'd be cool. But okay, so let's start.
Yeah.
Here we go. Okay, so again, we've looked at, some types of rhythmic entrainment, even effects of harmony, melody, all these other things. And I wanted to bring in another aspect again, which is the visual aspect, which I've mentioned this term before, photic driving. And photic driving is this is a quote from the medical lexicon, quote, a normal EEG phenomena whereby the frequency of the activity recorded over the perioccipital regions is time locked to the flash frequency during photic stimulation, which basically means that a particular flashing light at a frequency will time lock the brain waves into that frequency. And so, if we go back and look at, again, some of the brain frequencies that I mentioned, it's possible to also induce particular brain frequencies or change brain frequencies using flashing lights, types of sound, type of visual imagery. And especially you combine that with music, which we'll look into in much more detail in a second here, you do have kind of a powerful response mechanism there.
Anyway, so let's see, EEG photic driving response. You want to get into that?
Sure. Well, this is just, many, many papers. Just wanted to give an abstract of one particular test. Abstract of a particular study. And so I'll just read this real quick. So this is called the effect of photic driving on mood states. The EEG photic driving response is a sensitive neurophysiological measure. It has been used to assess drug effects, forms of epilepsy, neurological status of Alzheimer's patients, and physiological arousal. Photic driving also impacts the psychological status of a person by producing increased visual imagery and decreased physiological and subjective arousal. We'll get back to that in a second. Okay, in this study, 10 volunteers underwent nocturnal polysomnography. Okay, I'll skip through all the aspects of the test, but the mean mood across 6 daytime testing sessions was computed for all mood variables. Significant differences were found between the subjective moods, sleepy, alert, and effort, et cetera. But all participants recorded increased visual imagery during photic driving as measured by their response to an imagery questionnaire. And there's a lot of other research on that. That's just one study from Stanford. They did say that photic driving did not affect moods like angry, irritable, hungry, tense, happy, sexual, and sad. However, you don't know exactly what frequencies they used, right? So if you're using particular frequencies in delta, theta, depending on what type of brainwaves you're in training, you're going to get different responses. But this does show, at least from one of many studies, right, that photic driving can be a phenomena, trance phenomena. And so, if you think about it, when you watch television, you have these quick cuts. You look at the rhythm, the way the shots are being intercut. You look at the way the lights flash. And especially in music videos now, if you want to research this for photic driving responses, especially connected with the music, I'm certain you might come up with some interesting results.
All right. Trance induction, ladies and gentlemen, trance music. All of you burners, etc. out there. How many times we've been beating this one with a dead stick like hip hop, but it's like, trance is another word for hypnosis.
Yeah, well, trance, going into a trance, right? This is something, if you like listen to Richard Bandler, I have every single lecture he's ever done, and he's really far out. I mean, he'll go just ramble and not make any sense on a cognitive level. At the same time, he's doing very deep levels of trance induction, right? So trance induction or hypnotic induction is this induction, which is, we look at phase locking. You could look at it at another level. Obviously, it's much more complex than simply response of particular brainwave frequencies, but you're talking about your mind and physiology being induced, going into quote unquote altered state of consciousness. And there's a lot of different ways of inducing trance, which I'll talk about in a second here. But let me just read a quote about trance phenomena. Quote, trance phenomena result from the behavior of intense focusing of attention, which is a key psychological mechanism of trance induction. Adaptive responses, including institutionalized forms of trance, are tuned into neural networks in the brain and depend to a large extent on the characteristics of a culture. Culture-specific organizations exist in the structure of individual neurons and in the organizational formation of neural networks. So he's actually stating, and there's a lot of research on music and trance, but in a general way, what he's saying is that there's adaptive responses to trance that can become culturally specific and culturally programmed, that is tuned into neural networks in the brain, right? So it's not just the particular phenomena. So that's one thing I want to make clear. If you listen to, death metal or hip hop, it may not have a particularly bad effect on you. It may slightly alter your mood, but if you put that into the context of a subculture that you're part of, you put it into an institutionalized form of experience that becomes written on your brain, actually, in a certain way. And we look at neuroplasticity, which is, proven basically that the brain itself can be rewritten. We can lose abilities. We can lose perceptual abilities by neglecting them. There's cognitive neglect of certain abilities. We can also increase our capacity and aptitude. So we talked about listening to classical music and sort of challenging ourselves, making music difficult again, so it's not just something on the background. But if you look at this trance phenomena also being as a culturally specific, of course, it can be also there are certain factors of trance that are biological specific, right? There's certain things that will induce trance in anybody, but part of it is that foci of attention. What are you listening to? If you're in your environment, if you're at a rock show, if you're focusing intently on the latest Beyonce video or the latest Nicki Minaj, tantric, satanic, transhumanistic experience, this will most likely put you into a deeper trance. And the more you go into that trance, the more likely you're going to go into it. And the more you're in a social network, the more it becomes part of your culture, the more it is induced, but it becomes, again, written into the brain. And we'll go back into that a bit later. But I don't know if you want to throw something out about that, Jan.
Oh, not necessarily per se, but what I'm thinking is with all of this trance stuff, how can people recognize that they're slipping into a trance? It's like, you're nodding your head, you're tapping your foot, you're tapping along, doing this. What other signals are there for people to recognize or catch when they're entering a trance?
Well, one thing I want to state too, that, going into a trance is not necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, it is possible to go into a trance if, you're, so to speak, transported in a sort of an altered state of intense concentration and focus, right? So it's certainly not necessarily bad that you go into a trance. However, I mean, there's a couple different aspects to that question, which I think is very pertinent. One of them is that, well, I'm going to throw this out there. I just listened to a song, heard on the radio, because I do try to listen to music, on the radio here and then. Just a song called "Dance Hall Days." You know that song?
That was don't tell me the name, Howard Jones or something like that.
Yeah, and that song, I listened to that song, and the first thing I noticed was these lyrics are extremely disturbing. Take your lady by the hair, take your lady by the, I mean, they're very violent. There's like almost, and the way it's being sung is almost like, I realize I've heard this song so many times, and it's like in a kind of a mixolydian mode, kind of semi-happy, and you think it's like a dance song, but the actual lyrics and the delivery of the lyrics and the timing is actually pretty twisted. And I was surprised I couldn't get the song out of my head.
Wang Chung, my bad. Right after I said that, I was like, no, wait, but oh yeah, that's some old stuff there, man.
Yeah, it's old. Well, it was on the radio, man. I can't escape it. I just turned on the radio and I heard it.
And then you have that crap stuck in, I'm sure it's happened to everybody. So what about when they get you to sing along and repeat a song in your head for days on end and you can't get it out? You have to forcefully okay, this is going to stop, Well,
I think part of it is just, what I mean, okay, most of the time, to recognize you're in a trance. I mean, you can get in a trance when you're shopping, right? You can get into a trance when you get stressed out. I think that's one of the big, you can get stressed out about something and you go into a trance. You're running around looking for your keys. You're throwing stuff around the house, right? You can also in a concert setting, when you're watching television, there's a sense of letting go. I mean, all of us want to let go. All of us want to experience something larger than ourselves. And that's why I said I don't say per se trance or altered states of consciousness in and of themselves are not necessarily bad things. But the main thing is that when you find that there's unconscious processes that are being triggered and your mind is a little bit blank, you're no longer kind of aware of what you are, where you are. And there's a little bit of a blankness. There's like a cut. There's there's what's known as a psychological present. May have mentioned that. There's a certain, range of experience that we experience as being in the present moment. That's sort of like a short range of the attention span. Like an athlete, it has to be very focused and every second. But there's things where you'll go from a normal state and suddenly it's almost like your mind goes blank. There's like a cut in your psychological attention, and something may have triggered that. And this is, I'm not talking about, again, being, taking, 500 milligrams of LSD at a Dead show, but I'm just talking about day-to-day life. You're in a shopping mall and the song may come on. You may not even be aware of it, but it may shift you into a slightly altered state or a mode where you're a little bit, you've sort of lost conscious awareness of your environment. Let me just go back to that photic driving. There's one thing I thought was very important, that it reduced, let me find this here. Trying to find that quote, but basically it reduces it increases sort of a dreamy state, a dreamlike state, and decreases attentional awareness, decreases your beta waves or your conscious perception of what you're experiencing. And as we'll get into, these are very complicated phenomena, so it's not like I can just say one thing or that thing, but the primary thing is really to become aware of your environment, be aware of what you're feeding your mind. Whatever you put in your mind, you're feeding your brain. If you're watching, Naked and Afraid, or whatever the hell that show is called, all day, what are you feeding into your mind? What messages are being fed into your mind? Again, certain types, not all music is going to necessarily have these effects, but I do think there are certain songs, like what I'm saying, I heard that song Dance All Days, which I've heard hundreds of times. I'd never listened to the lyrics, and suddenly I was shocked. I said, wait, this song has been written on my subconscious, especially when I was growing up, whenever, I was a kid that came out, and then realizing that this is sort of like almost like a psychotic serial killer message embedded in the song. And I'm wondering, say, what has this done to me when I listen to this unconsciously? How has this affected my life? It may not have affected it that much, but that's an example of these induction networks, right? So you have a range of experience that are triggered by this. So, I mean, I think honestly, the main thing is just to be aware of your cultural environment, be aware of what's coming in and out of your mind in terms of what you're experiencing, and watch for points when you slip into states. And an easy way to do it, I think, is to find something. Say if something like triggers you to do something, you have like kind of a habitual behavioral response, something that's maybe a little bit less powerful. If you go, like say if you lose your keys and you go into like a key losing ritual and say, wait, I'm going into this trance behavior, and this maybe was done by myself. And that's a lot easier to notice that when it's sort of on a low scale. And then from that, I think you'll start to become aware of it. And then once you're consciously aware of it, I think a lot of the stuff can just dissolve, at least in terms of day-to-day trance induction. I'm not saying like obviously, massive, you and Cameron mind programming, but
good old you and Cameron.
Induction of trance is it's an important phenomenon, right? It's there's lots of levels of trance in lots of different places this happens. One of the earliest studies and the earliest uses of music and trance was in the military. Talked about this a bit, but using specific types of music and even specific types of cued responses to put people in type of a collective trance. Of course, shamanistic ritual, the shaman's rattle, all that stuff. But there's, a lot of different types of trance induction, right? And in fact, our media is majorly oriented towards that. But different types of induction include auditory induction, which we've talked about, kinesthetic, that's particular types of movement pattern, even physical sensation, visual or photic driving, so certain types of visual imagery can be used for trance induction, gustatory or olfactory, like taste and smell, and also trauma. So certain types of physical trauma, mental trauma also induces trance states. And also specific practices. For example, Jim Fixx, the guy that died of a heart attack, that wrote, the jogging guru, you get a runner's high, doing yoga. There's different types of, aesthetic or spiritual disciplines, people sitting on a bed of nails or whatever. And these things can also induce trance, but also psychological trauma does put you in a trance state as well, or traumatic, highly stressful events, sudden things that happen. So all these can produce trance states. And then again, let me go back to that earlier quote about trance, that these can become neurologically conditioned within societies and within individuals. So these trances, once they're ingrained, can be revivified, reactivated, and things like that.
All right. So now, how do you pronounce that? Apuleius?
Apuleius,
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is going back to the photic driving. We talked about photic driving. So we have studies from 125 AD using a flickering light with a potter's wheel to induce epilepsy. Ptolemy studied this in 200 AD. And in the 1930s and 1940s, scientists such as W. Gray Walter use electronic strobe lights and EEG equipment to alter brainwave activity, producing trance-like states of profound relaxation and vivid imagery. And guess who really was into that? Familiar with Brian Jinsum and the Dream Machine? These are these things that I actually tried to make one of these. But it's basically where you take a turntable, 78 RPM turntable, and you put a light in the middle and cut out different patterns, and this spins around, and you look at it, it'll put you into trance states. You can start hallucinating and stuff like that. So William S. Burroughs was very much interested into using photic driving to induce trances. There's a whole bunch of other research, but I wanted to show people that this is not something that just happened yesterday, or a 1990 study, but in the 1930s and 40s, this was being studied even as early as 125 AD. And so a lot of these techniques have been utilized throughout history in various ways. Whether or not they were scientifically understood is beside the point. The fact is they worked, right? But basically, this photic driving and induction does produce these hallucinatory states. And again, what's known as this twilight state, this sort of alpha state, or even, theta state, gives an access, which if you're doing it on yourself, if you're with a trusted hypnotherapist, if you're hanging out with Bateson or something and he's hypnotizing you, you can trust him. He's a good guy.
Well, I've got a buddy, Professor Jay Fikes, and, for years he was friends with Bateson, and he didn't even know that Bateson helped found the CIA. He had him over to his house, went over to his, but these people are into fooling others, and they just seem like normal guys. Most people think of CIA agents as these guys that go around in black suits and, fedoras or Stetsons, and they've got a black raincoat or something on with a machine gun on this side and a, something or other on the other side, going around just whacking people. But, most people don't get that that's not a true image of what an agent is. An agent is an author. They're a movie star, a musician, a politician, they're, a professor. Those are probably the most common roles that that these types are in.
Yeah, and there's also this idea of the habitus, which is again Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, talks about these ingrained behavioral and cultural response patterns. So, for example, if you're in a particular field and if you want to get funding, you may make small choices and say, oh, this is okay, this is not so bad, or you stop questioning things. And so it's very easy to also go along with this stuff without necessarily seeing yourself as a major conscious player, but it's just a question of making certain decisions along the way where you're kind of locked into something. So again, there's major players. There's a lot of people that are just part of these institutions. They want to keep their jobs. They want to keep their funding. And also, it's a lot easier to go along and accept the established viewpoint, the established belief system, than it is to contest it, especially if you're in, some kind of academic position or something else where you're very much dependent on how others perceive you. And as soon as you get that black mark of death, then you're not going to get you lost your funding, you lost everything, and they're going to bring out all kinds of forces. And a lot of times these things aren't, the habitus, as Bourdieu says, isn't even evident until you go against its boundaries. So you may never know that this stuff is even there, and you may operate in this whole system without
and that's with your direct peer reviews. Imagine sociologically speaking, and friends, family, other public figures, you try to bring this out, not in a 20-hour lecture format for people to understand, but you're sitting in a restaurant trying to have a conversation with somebody about what you do, and they just look at you like you're bonkers.
Or people just like, oh, don't talk about that. It's stressful. I mean, I've tried to bring this up to people.
Or you're paranoid.
No, I've had people literally. I mean, I've had people like when I was doing that research, like on the Rolling Stones and all the other stuff like that with the whole Altamont and all these weird connections. And I tried to talk about it with people. I had people like literally like almost like it was almost like I physically pushed them over. Like they were so disturbed by it. And it's like, well, hey, I'm just telling you, here's some facts and some weird coincidences, make of it what you will, but it's...
What, in your opinion, just to segue quickly here, what do you think people should do, just not try to speak to others about this stuff, just keep it to the simpleton talk, or, what should people do when they're afraid of being accused of being paranoid or a conspiracy theorist or what have you?
I think the important thing is to realize that who you're talking to, and so not to overwhelm people, but then also I don't think it's something where, I think if you don't talk about this stuff, if you don't start to change as I mentioned, you have a dominant mode of discourse, you have certain type of social barriers that are put in place. And these firewalls, you don't run into them until you push against them. And then suddenly you see how people, get uncomfortable, or, in a greater extent, you get fired from your job or something. But basically, I think it's important to talk about it, but in a gentle way that's very slow, and sort of lead people to it, allow them to say some things that allow them to come to their own conclusions. I mean, I think in a certain way you almost have to be kind of not tricky, but I think that, you know, if you start raving to somebody or even just talking like we're talking right now to the average person, they're probably just going to immediately just either run away or just get very violently, aggressively against you. So I think it's important not to hide the information, but also not to become like a roadside preacher, but find a way to let people, hey, did you see that? What did you think of that?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, you know, it's just, okay, so we're in the middle of doing this whole series, and for the last week and a half, I've been editing part 6, and yesterday I was over over at a friend's house, and, you know, he puts on the 60s classic rock, and, you know, he looks up at me and he says, yeah, this is my type of music, you know, and it's just, you know, I mean, I was just, here's all of this information, and I've tried to kind of talk to him about it before, but he just poo-pooed it and, you know, didn't want to research it. You know, he's got a background, and I think he's got a BA in psychology, so, you know, he thinks he's studied all that and been all there. But I mean, he's just so caught, you know, and it's like the information is there, but, you know, what do you do?
Yeah, you know, I mean, at that point, I think you just kind of, you know, you look at it, and you also have to understand that for somebody, to be honest, like for some people, for them to break free of this conditioning may be more traumatic than having the conditioning. You know, if their whole lives are based on it, they may be so shattered. You know, it's kind of like the guru, someone's in a cult and they find out their guru is sleeping with all the disciples. You know, that may be so psychologically shattering that they can't, you know, that the level of cognitive dissonance may be too much, or else they're just going to completely resist. So it's more, sometimes you just got to kind of let it go, maybe approach another avenue. I mean, you know, again, it is certainly a difficult question, but I think, you know, we should realize that one thing is important, not to judge people and say, well, hey, I've been there too, right? I've been there, I was there. And so that, you know, just have that compassion a little bit, and not, because it's also easy to kind of look down and look at someone and say, hey, you're listening to all this stuff. And, you know,
and it's like, it was so hilarious too, because, you know, I'm standing there and the typical songs come on, and then like, you know, Beatles, All You Need Is Love, and the whole bit was just right there, you know, and just boop, there the guy was right back in his little mind control from the 60s and early 70s. Whoop.
Yeah.
Brain goes on tilt.
Yeah, you know, and it's, you know, it's like, it's certainly a difficult thing, but you know, I think it's more of a gradual process. I think what we're talking about in certain ways pretty advanced stage, in that you can look at various political events and the banking system, et cetera, which are much more external. But then when you start really getting inside your own life experience and realizing these things, it's a lot more difficult to unpack that, and you're going to get a lot more resistance. So I think that it does take a certain stage, so to speak, of evolutionary awareness, you know.
All right, let's jump into John Lilly. You know, he's another one of people's heroes, and they're going to be extremely upset about all of this kind of stuff. But anyway.
Yeah, well, you know, we'll get into John Lilly in detail in a second here, but you know, John Lilly is one of those people. Well, I won't delve into it now. We'll move on a little bit later. But so the use of this photic driving has been used for something known as rescripting, which is sort of rewriting traumatic memories, rewriting sort of identity. It's mostly used in a therapeutic context. But John Lilly talks about metaprograms and reprogramming and metaprogramming. So that is a type of rescripting. And in fact, photatory and auditory driving can be used for, again, quote, rescripting, but we're really talking about rewiring particular deep set psychological functions within the mind, in a lot of times to the point where they're completely unconscious, won't even know anything had happened to you, right? These will change behavior, perception, memory, and thought, but on a way that is far below the subconscious threshold. Combined photic and auditory driving can use for trance induction. So again, we talked about already crowd control or crowd stimulation. It can be used to create different emotional responses. Just go into your average shopping mall, go into any one of these highly engineered environments. You'll see this all around you, okay? And also produce visual and auditory hallucinations. So photic and auditory driving are in fact quite powerful mechanisms to change the mind. And again, these can be used subtly. Like you can have a shot of a shot of Mad Dog, or you can drink a bottle of single malt Scotch. You're going to have a much more greater effect if you knock off a bottle of single malt Scotch. On the other hand, there's still a substance that's affecting you in a certain way.
You're going to be a lot less sick with the Scotch as well.
Yeah, I was just trying to. I was about to say wine cooler, and that's. But so let's move on. Let's look at this, how this applies to music. So we have next thing is a rave light show. Okay, and these are examples of highly complex, highly engineered environments using massive amounts of auditory stimulation, photic driving, and in fact, taking people into a dreamlike or trance-like state, and having really powerful or potentially very powerful effects on the individual. Much more so, I think, than people realize. The next slide is an example of the 1960s, sort of a little collage of some of the psychedelic light shows from the 60s. And I did have a bunch of...
Well, and the 60s stuff is just so amateur.
It really is. It's very amateur. It really looks pretty sad compared to the high-tech rave
Oh,
stuff.
boy, yeah. Well, and you sent some links to me earlier today. What was the website called that were just this... sfxii.com. Ladies and gentlemen, go check that out. Wow.
They're one of the number one major producers of these rave events. They bought up a lot of these other smaller festivals, and you just watch that, and just each different venue has a whole different spinning. But even every one of those videos, not only is it trance induction, but they're taking you into a whole different mental space, operating on a different psychological aspect. And in terms of the 60s light shows, I had a bunch of patents talking about, light driving, sound driving from the 50s, 60s. I was going to get into. I decided that would be too much material. But needless to say, if you notice the 60s light shows, you suddenly, you not only have the, Boris Meyer's sound light laboratory that he's experimenting with the radio project, but, not only have these bands, but suddenly you have these huge, you have strobe lights. Lots of strobe lights going on there with psychedelic stuff, right? You got your lava lamps, you got all this other stuff. So just notice how with the 60s rock, suddenly these light shows just came kind of from out of nowhere, right? I mean, this, and especially if you look at, say, Burroughs, again, Burroughs was, I guess, primarily looking to, get nice types of hallucinations. But if you look at the use of, if you look at it from a scientific basis, the music, the whole social milieu, going back to my first points in the beginning, you do see a very, very powerful network of forces that I'm not saying it does, but could potentially tremendously transform entire populations and literally implant different types of psychological mechanisms they would be completely unaware of, or by and large unaware of, unless they broke down. So, anyways, so let's talk a little. Go ahead.
Rave and carnival culture.
Yeah. So this ties a bit into Bakhtin. I talked about this Russian literary theorist and Rabelais, who talks about the carnival. And this has been one of the ways that scholars use to understand the rave. And let me say that most of the research on raves, and I do have a lot of quotes from various writers on rave culture be covering, tends to look at it as something as a pretty benign and positive phenomena overall. But one thing about the rave culture and the carnival is that you do create these subcultures, right, where certain types of behaviors are accepted. And let me just read this quote from Becker, quote, where people who engage in deviant activities have the opportunity to interact with one another. They are likely to develop a culture built around the problems rising out of the differences between their definition of what to do and the definition held by other members of society. Does that not sound like the sort of the main definition, right, of so many different subcultures?
Sure. Well, you know, yeah, I mean, and they get you in that groupthink, essentially, to get you to commit the deviant behavior, etc. But, yeah, I mean, it's all based on this groupthink, crowd manipulation, etc. And then you toss in lights and drugs and lasers and satanic symbolism on top of it.
Yeah, and again, it's when we again look at this, the idea of programming, not, once you're looking at a mechanistic behaviorist model, right, in a certain way you're limited because you're discounting a whole array of inner phenomena that we all know we have. That if you're going to say this inner phenomena doesn't exist, I'm going to swear you're full of shit, right? We have emotions, we have memories, we have dreams, we have imaginations. We're not just robotic automatons. At the same time, once these types of mechanisms start to employ and work with the more sort of esoteric or non-physical psychological aspects, that's when it gets a little bit more dangerous and disconcerting. So let me just talk a little about the rave culture. So just to show how much of an impact rave culture had, in 1993, the British rave market brought in approximately $2.7 billion in 1993. That's a lot of money just in England. And this is a quote about, I have several quotes here, but quote, fully licensed and often held in nightclubs, raves now penetrated to the center of British youth culture. So we have an example, if we look back at that thing about the deviant behavior, we have something where this becomes a major social phenomena, and a lot of people just want to go out and have a good time. They want to go to a dance club. They don't necessarily want to take ecstasy. They don't necessarily want to go and, go on a super, mind-altering, personality reshaping drug experience, but their friends are going, you know what I mean? And so in a sense, this is, if you invert that last quote about deviant cultures, the deviant, quote unquote, deviant culture can be it can be, the subculture can become mainstream and then become a vehicle for the deviant culture and start to bring in many, many other people to subscribe to that, by other means. And then, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and so when we talk about rave music and electronic dance music, it is very important to understand that it really was a drug-based music. I mean, even more so than psychedelic rock or whatever, because you could certainly, this is a music that the experience of it, the listening to it, the collective
almost requires you be high to get it. Almost like the Grateful Dead. Like when people say, "Oh, well, Grateful Dead sucks." Well, wait till you hear them when you're high.
Yep.
It's like techno, I remember in the 90s when I first heard techno, it just drove me absolutely crazy. Even today, most of it drives me crazy. There was only a few DJs like Goa Gill that I ever really cared for.
Yeah. And I was in Goa, I was there at that time when the techno thing just took off. And, myself, I was like a serious student of sitar, and I think I mentioned this before, but I went to a couple raves just to check them out. I didn't take ecstasy, but it was one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. But I literally heard the music, and it felt like poison. I was like, what the hell is this? I didn't know anything about stuff we're talking about now, but it had that experience of sort of having an aversion to it. But, it's something where people try to, get me into it. But anyways, even more so than the 60s rock, in that the MDNA, the rave music they are one and one, right?
I also notice one thing about, and I haven't been to one in probably, 15 years at least, 10 years probably. But, they seem to be divided up into groups for mushrooms and another group for MDMA or ecstasy. And then even sometimes, those for LSD, but those seem to be the three primary ones. But the ecstasy raves have much more of a poppy, bouncy sort of thing, whereas, the mushroom raves have a more spiritual, serene, deeper sort of sound to them.
Yeah, no, certainly. So this phenomenon, again, this rave phenomena, and then we're not going to get into whether or not this was just an organic phenomenon or not, but certainly we're looking at all the things that I just touched on in the beginning. Let me another quote. This is from a DJ, whatever. It says, quote, "In general, the purpose of the music played at raves is to make people dance, but it is more than that. The music has to take people to another place. Most music played at raves is intended to lose yourself in. Techno played at raves is a faceless, nameless organism. Time stops when the mind's clock of frequent distractions is disconnected by the surreal, hypnotic, syncopated rhythms being woven around your head by the DJ. Time stops and the vibe begins." So, it's sort of directly, it's clearly stating that the whole purpose of this is to put people into this altered state of consciousness. But I would sort of argue they're going into a dreamlike state, but it's sort of like a waking dream. And in this case, though, that if you're lying at home falling asleep, if you're listening to a nice piece of music and relaxing, it's nice to go into that state. If it's being induced in this collective environment with massive other amounts of stimulation, you're basically like, I say it's equivalent. I hope I don't offend anybody by this, but it's equivalent to a woman just taking off her clothes and says, "Hey, have at me." You know what I mean? Because that's what you're doing to your own mind in a certain way, and you're just letting.
It's mental rape instead of physical rape, essentially.
Well, yeah, but I wouldn't necessarily call it rape because there's this voluntary acquiescence, right? And I think most people don't know what's happening. So let me just read a few more rave quotes from some of the scholarship on this. Okay, so rave culture had produced the largest youth cultural phenomenon that Britain had ever seen. Ecstasy culture had become the primary leisure activity for British youth, seamlessly integrated into the fabric of a weekend ritual. From 1990 onwards, its sound, signs, symbol, and slang had become all-pervasive, part of the everyday landscape. This is from Altered State, The Story of Ecstasy, Culture, and Acid House. So what this is saying, and this is well-researched scholarship, that in fact ecstasy, the majority of British youth, it's now, if you wanted to fit in, if you wanted, not only that, if you wanted to go out to a club, but you had to take ecstasy because not only what everyone else was doing it, but the entire drug culture percolated up, not directly necessarily as a drug culture, but as the entire rave fashion, as the entire ethos, and basically took over an entire generation in England. And and again, I don't think that
keep them high and dancing, and they'll think they're free.
Yeah, but again, I think it's that's why I say I think it goes much beyond just this distraction and just this stultifying aspect of keeping people dumb. I mean, it's much more pernicious and deeper than that. Let me just keep going on. Here's a few more things about rave culture. Quote, "DJing is not just about choosing a few tunes. It is about generating shared moods. It is about understanding the feelings of a group of people and directing them to a better place. In the hands of a master, records become the tools for rituals of spiritual communion that for many people are the most powerful events in their lives." Okay. And this is certainly true, right? I mean, what happens, again, is that you get a certain type of state of ecstasy. You get a certain type of freedom that is not available anywhere else in your life. And that state of ecstasy, this transcendent experience, is indelibly linked with taking this drug with this particular subculture. Now, that particular transcendent state, you may have found that in a different way, in a more naturally constructed social environment. But when you're living in this particular modern technocratic, psychotronic era, there's not a lot of people don't have much scope. They're really, life is pretty dull. So so these experiences are there, but they're being completely interlocked with this entire social mechanism. And you want to throw some in?
Well, no, I was just going to add, which is basically a Dionysian ritual, but I'll let you hit that.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. I talked in the last one about the Apollonian Dionysian rituals. So, just to state this, that when you have the absence of transcendent values in a culture, when you lose your tradition, when you lose religion, or religion meaning when you lose some type of belief system or some type of order that allows for this expression or understanding of something beyond yourself, and of course there's people that will go beyond conventional religion and into maybe a deeper understanding or a different way. But when in society in general, everything is reduced to just the basic stimulus response network of shopping and stress and your Pavlovian, conditioned office little cubicle, as you're like a little rat in your own little rat maze with your little cheese when you get your coffee on your 15-minute break. Not insulting anyone who does that, because I've done that, but
there was a wake-up call for those of you who needed to get to part 7 to get to that.
Yeah. So there's a huge vacuum, right, in our society, and then also we don't have these meaningful connections with other people, right? You don't have organic musical cultures. There's a lot of our social identities have been stripped. I mean, not everybody, right? I'm certain there's a lot of people that have very vibrant, interconnected community lives, but I'd say for the mass of people, they don't. And even if they do, we're trained with this kind of idea of I want to get one up against the other person, this whole, uber competitive thing. So what steps in? This Dionysian release, this ecstasy. And the word ecstasy, right? Ecstasis, right? The word ecstasy, ecstasis. You're crossing this boundary. You're going into this other state. And this is, I think, is a pretty good quote on rave. This is Vretland. I'm sorry, I think it's a Swedish name, but quote, "Rave was a threat to the symbolic order. No meaning could be found other than pure escape, suggesting perhaps a type of tourism. There was the excitement of spending money that had lost its exchange value and driving into the darkness, the unknown. A disappearance from daily material realities by an undoing of the constructed self in a Dionysian ritual is the ultimate effect." So, you're looking at this, I think, is a very, very wise, or I'd say astute description of that, because it is a type of tourism, right? It's a type of psychedelic tourism. And you're spending money because money itself has become meaningless, right? You're in a materialistic culture, but yet when you're surrounded by all this and you have this manipulated, commodity exchange networks where, money itself becomes this virtual, numbers on vast supercomputers that no one understands except me. Just joking. But the fact is, there is, you're undoing this socialized self that you've been trapped into in your school, and you're breaking free, but actually your freedom is breaking you right into the next box, unfortunately. And that's what's kind of disconcerting, but I think it's definitely a very interesting phenomena there.
Violations of boundaries.
Yeah. So I'm going to give some quotes from Bakhtin, again, the Russian literary scholar. He talks about Rabelais, but this, as I've mentioned many other occasions, finding with Rabelais this direct connection to a lot of this occult work, direct connection to all of this esoteric and scientific research that helped formulate this idea of the clockwork man, of this particular ascendant group of men. But also this idea of distorting boundaries. Let me just read some quotes from this. Quote, "Carnival strives to encompass and unite within itself both poles of evolution, or both members of antithesis, birth, death, young age, top, bottom, face, backside, praise, abuse, affirmation, negation, the tragical, the comical, etc." Okay, next one. "The essential principle of grotesque realism is degradation. That is the lowering of all that is high, spiritual, ideal, abstract. It is to transfer to the material world, to the sphere of earth and body in their indissoluble unity." Another quote, "As a shifting series of vortices of energy, the sight of unanchored polysemy," and polysemy means actually multiple streams of meaning, so it's kind of a postmodern term there, "and radical differentiality. The grotesque body is given to excess, and thus to giganticism and hyperbole of the artistic form, its outside noses and swollen buttocks, and the masks that emphasize metamorphoses and the violation of natural boundaries." So this is the idea of the carnival as bringing heaven to earth, as inverting good and evil, as transforming the body, the physical body. If you look at all the body transformational stuff, you can go back to Alice in Wonderland, but look at all the music videos, how people's minds and bodies are being transformed and going through all these weird distended states. And that's actually part of what goes on in some of these the rave itself. If you look, just look at Burning Man, right? It's a great example of this violation of boundaries and creating this unanchored and just massive difference, but also this inversion, right? So you're really celebrating this distortion. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just reading the Oxford English Dictionary here and their entry on carnival, and it's the removal of flesh. The name of being originally proper to the eve of Ash Wednesday. The actual carnivale appears to have come through the intermediate carnivale cited by Carpentier from the document of 1130. And this says the season immediately preceding Lent devoted in Italy and other Roman Catholic countries to revelry and riotous amusement, Shrovetide, the festivity of this season, high carnival. And so anyway, it's just, based on that, I started looking up the origins of it, and it's related to debauchery, essentially.
Yeah, and it's also, we had these certain, these particular things where, the king, you could like throw rotten apples at the king or whatever. But, reading Rabelais, looking at Bakhtin, he talks about cannibalism. He talks about murder. He talks about, these eating feces, all this stuff as part of the carnival. Okay. And celebrating it because you're creating this freedom. You get this total freedom through this. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Okay. Well, there's also, I think, really what also is happening to a certain extent is changing our psychological body minds or body images, right? How your body is written onto your mind, how you perceive your body. I mean, how can people, get plastic surgery so they look like lizards, they look like a cat, or I have nothing against tattoos. I don't have any tattoos, but
yeah, I'm sorry. I thought about getting a tat once in my late 20s or early 30s. And, looking back, I'm really glad I didn't, because nothing that you like or appreciate in your 20s or 30s will you like it and appreciate in your 30s, 40s, and 50s. And you're going to look back, and the only thing it's going to be is a reminder of how dumb you were when you got it, Yeah,
well, it's one thing to get a tattoo on your arm. It's another thing when your entire body is covered in tattoos.
Yeah.
And you're pierced everywhere and all this stuff. So, again, I'm not dissing tattoo culture. I could talk about the origins of tattoo culture, how it took off. That's a tangent. I won't get in there, but people should be aware to a certain extent that a lot of these things, this is kind of leading towards sort of a transhumanist sense, right? You become more dissociated from your mind body. And there's so many examples of music videos of this. Okay, and there's so many examples with people playing video games and children's minds being encoded. I remember I played a video game with my son, and I was almost kind of tripping a bit. I was like, wow, everything looks like this video game. I'm this, So these things do have effects, and again, sometimes they're beyond the awareness threshold. So let's look at another aspect of rave culture. This is another type of dissolution. This is dissolving gender. So I read a quote, so it's not just me saying it. That's what I did here. I try to, not that
Yeah.
that's an issue I had because a lot of times.
Insert Bruce gender quote here.
Yeah. But anyways, the atmosphere is one of unity.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the atmosphere is one of unity, of dissolving differences in the peace and harmony haze of the drug ecstasy. The irony of this present social moment is that working class boys lose their aggro, I guess their aggression, and become new men, not through the critique of masculinity, which accompanies changing modes of femininity, but through the use of ecstasy. They undergo a conversion to the soft, the malleable, the sociable rather than the antisocial. And through the most addictive pleasures of dance, they enter into a different relationship with their own bodies, more tactile, more sensuous, less focused around sexual gratification. Rave favors groups and friends rather than couples or those in search of a partner. Or how about men who, have just cut their own balls off, are never going to raise kids? Okay.
Yeah, what was that ancient Greek ritual where they did that and then they'd run through the village and throw their testicles through people's windows?
Well, the hijras, I mentioned that. There's actually certain families, one of their kids, they will donate them to the hijras, and they will get this like very brutal castration, some of them with just God knows, like a razor blade or something. Sorry, really unpleasant. But there is this sense, let me just state this though, that there are deviant things. There are forces in society, and in a naturally functioning society, these things will be there, but they'll be there in their own place, not as blown up and become the entire mass dominant culture. But I think this is from a feminist, right? And this, the quote I just read, and this shows, and this is very positively valence. This is not a critique of rave culture. This is a celebration of rave culture. But just think about that. Look what people are doing to themselves. Not only a dissolution of their physical bodies, but a changing of their own gender identities, aggression men. They're becoming multicultural tools. And
and men are supposed to be essentially the hunters and women the gatherers. So what they're doing is they're feminizing the men essentially with this, as well as the underlying thing here, making men not be men so that they can be malleable and pliable to their agendas.
Yeah, exactly.
And not a threat to, the system. Because, essentially that's what, man as provider and protector, especially when you have a family, what you want to do is build and acquire all you can for your children. So they want to break that so that you're just this, kind of listless, what do they call them? Metrosexual,
Yeah, and also, you're burning out your pleasure circuitry, right? You're getting this incredible experience, right? At the same time, you're getting the rest of your life look just flat and boring, right? You have these weekends where you're suddenly flying in this interstellar, collective organism, dancing on your satanic imagery, photic driving, mindless techno cloud. And then you go back to the office on Monday. And so you're creating this, we talked about this split, right? You're creating this dissociative state as well. But let's, so again, I am not claiming or making any statement that I'm saying rave culture is directly connected or part of some kind of military intelligence operation. But
I'll jump in. I'll say that for you. I think it is personally. maybe there's some organic stuff out there too, but when you follow Go a Gill out of Tim Leary's group and that whole thing and the rise, I mean, and as well when you connect it in with transhumanism, when you look at the whole, Silicon Valley and all of that, and how Burning Man and all of this type of music came out essentially out of that area, just like the Grateful Dead and the rest of it. I'm gonna just say on my part that I think it's definitely military op there.
Okay. Yeah, and even one other aspect of rave culture, talking about narrative, right? So you've got this sampled music. You've taken away actual live music. You're now kind of regurgitating, recycling this past. You're getting these little sound bites of past musical like memory, and so it's kind of like the Muzak you hear in the grocery store, where it's the endless classic rock thing. You're breaking a sense of narrative continuity. You're breaking a sense of history and creating this kind of non-space end of history realm. Well, let's go ahead and move into. Let's just look at some of the documents from the government and just look at how they run operations. So, you mean to go and start here? So
jump in.
This is from the Information Operations Roadmap, Department of Defense 2002, classified document. And this is a mandate of the IO roadmap. The DPG assigned under the Secretary of Defense in coordination with the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Command, Control, and Communication, and the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, CJCS, to develop a comprehensive IO roadmap for presentation to the Secretary of Defense. The IO roadmap was to address the full scope of IO as a core military competency and include supporting studies on policy, plans, organization, education, careers, force, analytic support, psychological operations, operations security, electronic warfare, military deception, and computer network operations. So that's just an example of one of these interconnected organizations. And then this is from the same document. Another quote. In particular, PSYOP must be refocused on adversary decision-making, planning well in advance for aggressive behavior modification during times of conflict. PSYOP products must be based on in-depth knowledge of the audience's decision-making processes and the factors influencing his decisions, produced rapidly at the highest quality standards, and powerfully disseminated directly to targeted audiences through the areas of operations. Another quote, we must improve network and electromagnetic attack capabilities, dominate electromagnetic spectrum with attack capabilities. And then the next quote, future operations require that PSYOP capabilities be improved to enable PSYOP forces to rapidly disseminate and generate audience-specific commercial quality products into denied areas. Okay, and these products focus on aggressive behavior modification of adversaries at the operational and tactical levels of war. But the important thing is understand they're talking about their stuff as products. So they're creating products based on knowledge, based on audience formation, creating commercial products based on a particular market. Look at youth in England. You have the Thatcherite years. You have a huge body of disenfranchised youth, right? A lot of males, working class jobs. That you can look at that. You look at it targeting to a particular audience and creating a product. So I just keep going.
Yeah, let's jump into crowd control and manipulation here. I mean, we might as well just jump through all of these because this is really what ties it all together. So this is essentially what you're undergoing when you're at these huge rave parties or even concerts for that matter. And something that I wanted to mention, I sent an email to you about it the other day, Hans, was that people also need to realize that these, a concert and its followers, a band's followers, is essentially a cult. And the live music performance, it would almost be like the cult's church, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for certain bands, and I do want to say this. I mean, people should support independent music. I mean, and that's of course what I do and stuff like that. But if you look at some of these big pop groups and these rock bands and all this stuff, certainly you're looking at people that are. I mean, even I got to open for Jimmy Buffett. He's got his fans of 40 plus parrot heads, parrot heads. And I'll tell you, Jimmy Buffett is a bitch when it comes to money. He's all smiles and margaritas on stage, backstage. Don't cross him with the money. But anyways, Jimmy, I hope you're not listening to this. I really doubt you are.
I used to have a roommate that was hugely into him, and just just like any Deadhead or anything else. And I could never get into it. She played it constantly. I really, I tried it many times. I couldn't get past Margaritaville.
Yeah, well, another thing, how about sports? I mean, sports is exactly the same thing here in a different way,
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, people that, hey, we're all ready for the Sunday night football game and whatever. I'm like, all right, have fun. I used to have groups of friends that would go and party together, and I was always left. I mean, if I could maybe pay attention, no matter how hard I tried, for 10 or 15 minutes of the game.
Yeah. The people are like, I remember one friend of mine was sitting watching something. He started like throwing chairs out the window when his term, in the college dorm. He was just so, I don't know.
Well, and it's in the United States, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, it's all corporations. These teams are owned. They probably make deals in the back. At least in Europe, the only time I was ever able to get involved or interested in sports at all was in Europe. Because, in Europe, it's like countries battling war. And, and when I lived in Europe, the Serbs always won everything. So it was like Serbs were the European basketball champion, the international basketball champion, the European soccer champion, the international soccer champion, etc. But, there was always some team being put together to beat them. So it always made it really interesting, especially when I lived in Serbia, because, the people got so behind it, but they were always, the number one team. Even the presentation of it in Europe is still mind control all the same, because, obviously the countries are using it as a form of warfare between each other.
Yeah, but obviously football is, football is extremely brutal, causing massive neurological damage to many, many people. But also, it's pretty goddamn boring. I'm sorry. It's soccer is a lot more fast paced, and there's a lot more strategy involved with American football, I should say.
Yeah, football. There
football.
We go.
All right, so let me just read some more
sure
government stuff. And so this is crowd control and manipulation. So this is from Operational Threats of the Civil Disturbance Environment. It's an Army Field Manual. Quote, being part of a crowd of people has certain effects on different people. Each individual in a crowd is susceptible to behaving in a way that is contrary to their normal behavior. Some reasons for these behavior are as follows. Crowds provide individuals with a sense of anonymity. With so many others, an individual realizes he's just another face in the crowd, giving him a sense of invulnerability. Crowds and individual behavior are impersonal. Crowds and individual behaviors are impersonal by nature. The them against us attitude affords those within the crowd the ability to freely be verbally abusive, throw objects, or attack anyone who gets in the way. Continue. Crowds provide individuals with the idea that their moral responsibility have shifted from themselves as a person to the crowd as a whole. Large numbers of people discourage individual behavior.
Indeed. There it is right there, ladies and gentlemen.
That sounds a little bit like our rave culture. And before I go to the next slide, which is just a real nice breakdown of the whole process of developing media, just wanted to run through some of these rock concerts with a number of deaths. And we talked about Altamont quite a bit, but there's a whole bunch of concerts that, and this is just the top 10, this particular list, but there's, many other concerts. But so the World Series of Rock, 1979, have swarms of fans rioting, people were shot. acts of violence and vandalism, poor safety, World Series of Rock. You have the Who in 1979. Probably remember that. All the people being trampled right here in Ohio. 11 fans crushed to death. Dozens of fans injured in a stampede. Uses festival. There's always an excuse. Oh, they use festival seating.
Well, sure, and number 2 on that list is San Bernardino, and I'm 12 minutes from San Bernardino here in the San Bernardino Mountains. I was a block from where this riot happened earlier today.
Yeah, Monsters of Rock, Montreal Riot, Guns N' Roses, Woodstock 99. And Woodstock 99 I talked about, but that's where you have people, you had the band member, you had Chili Peppers, you had Limp Bizkit directly calling for this stuff. The Chili Peppers had everyone light peace candles and then sing the song Fire, et cetera. And there was 4 rapes. Limp Bizkit's had a song, basically very sexually charged, violent song, Pearl Jam, Marilyn Manson, et cetera, et cetera. So, you have a lot of these instances. And then if you look at, sometimes these things happen, but you also have to wonder why, you look at 1979, a couple of these things happening, you look at why this particular venue, this happened there. And if you go back and look at some of the ELF stuff I talked about, it's very, very possible to use these things as nice little experimental zones and induce behaviors, induce collective behaviors. And then you have this whole array of forces. Again, you have the crowd mentality, you have all these other photic driving, auditory driving, you have the intoxication, etc. So just a little aside there. And so let's move on to the Army Field Manual from 1994. And this is the production. I might have to give you a new copy. It's a little bit hard to read there, but this is
how, read it. It's all right.
You can read it. Okay, yeah. So this is basically how you look at creating your PSYOP products and how you go through the PSYOP mission, disseminating product development, target audience intelligence gathering, target audience analysis, product development, media selection, et cetera, dissemination. And this is sort of the circle. And look at all these things: environmental influence, cultural influences, et cetera. So this is something that just sort of shows the overall deployment. There's a bunch of different forms that go along with this, how you do types of analysis. But this is sort of how you develop your cultural products for PSYOP missions. And won't go into detail there, but just to say that this is certainly very well researched. Another quote from Army Field Manual: stress is mental, emotional, or physical tension or strain. A person's life could be less stressful if his biological and psychological needs were automatically gratified. So let's talk about that frustration, right? People have. But many obstacles exist that interfere with the ability to reach a desired goal. And these obstacles place stress on an individual. How about tons of disenfranchised youth in Thatcherite England who have lost their careers, their towns are turning into wastelands, no future, right? PSYOP personnel must learn to recognize stress-causing factors or situations and exploit them to the fullest when planning and conducting PSYOPs. Attitudes are consistent, learned, emotionalized predispositions to respond in a particular way to a given object, person, or situation. Opinions and belief are closely related to attitudes, but they differ in that an opinion or belief refers to what one knows or assumes to be true, whereas an attitude is how a person feels about something. Since opinions have their basis in assumptions, it is easier to change a person's opinions and beliefs than his attitudes. Attitudes affects behavior, especially when the attitudes are important to a person. Strong attitudes are not always a guarantee that the individual will behave accordingly, etc. But this is just showing the use of stress, right? Looking at the stress points, the stress causal points, the fault line, and exploiting those, okay? And looking how people cannot fulfill their biological or psychological or material needs. Look at stress points, some of which may be unconscious, and to exploit those. All right, should I just keep going?
Yeah, let's dive in here to just right into satanic ideology.
Okay, so as I've discussed, there's a lot of this overflow between occult activities, as well as those of, it looks like my notes disappeared. Are you familiar with this, the MK Ultra sub operation that dealt with like occult stuff? You know what I'm talking about?
Well, I know it's there. I don't know what specific sub project.
Yeah, no, I had that. My notes disappeared, so I don't have that. But there was. Oh well, that's all right. We have a little technical stuff. There's specific MK Ultra, sub project that dealt with actually occult, not only dealing with occult research, psychic research, demonology, all this occult stuff, as included directly in the MK Ultra program. Okay, so, but this idea of this, I had talked about, before, about this this idea of Satanism, or this ideology of power, full will to power, and this is from a Satanist, direct quote from a Satanist. Quote: "First, it is about rebellion against the conformity of the present, and I mean a real rebel, a real outlaw, someone who cuts a dash, who has charisma, whose very presence makes others uneasy, and one who does not have to wear some stupid costume to do this. Second, try something to see if you can get away with it. So get off your arse, you suckers, and make Satan proud. Learn to do evil. What is evil? All that restricts life. All that tries to constrain the possibilities. Doing evil means breaking these restrictions and constraints and just taking the consequences of your actions. Just do it. Just discover. Just smash the chains that hold most others in thrall and never bow down to anyone or anything. Smash them first or die."
Well, and that's even double speak, because all that restricts life is in fact Satanism itself, and what they're trying to do is break family, break culture, break critical thinking and survival and anything that would do, and get everybody in this, positive thinking, dancing, trancing sort of mood, which is restricting life itself. And then, going back to our discussion on GMOs in part 6, etc., they're trying to own all life itself. So, even this here, this quote that you just read is spin in itself.
Yeah, but also, the Satanists, I had to go delve through all this literature, and it's posited that most people are like worms, right? You're the Uberman. You are the developed, the full man, and people that are still restricted by morality are prisoners, right? And it says even go beyond archetypes, right? You have to fully embody sheer power in your being. And so the average person rebelling and doesn't even know that, well, they're actually, you look at what does that sound like, the Carnival doctrine? Doesn't that sound similar?
Well, and that's, but again, that's, while you may think you're free, that's diving you off over here and over there and everywhere. And then at the end of your life, you look around and you go, what did I build? What did I do? Did I get free? Being a little socialist, relying upon the government, etc. Having lots of sex with, lots of women or whatever you do. Did that really free you in any way? And I don't think it does. Yeah, sure, you might break out of the family structure paradigm, which has gotten us through, all time. But, are you free at the end of the day? To me, it seems freedom would be working hard and preferably having a partner where you can share that work to, achieve mutual long-term goals. And then look back at the end of life at what you created.
No, exactly. And, I totally agree with you. And the thing is, though, the satanic ideology, most people who are even indulging in group sex or taking all kinds of drugs, and they're not going to necessarily want to say, hey, I'm evil. I've embraced evil. I'm embracing the dark. Because I had a bunch of other quotes I didn't put up, but basically they talk about embracing the abyss, embracing evil, embodying it. Most people aren't going to want to take that choice, but in fact, they're living that ideology and leading themselves to that. I mean, you may have known people that have gotten so much into different kinds of highs. They go from, smoking a bit of weed to, end up doing S&M to doing, hard drugs and, whatever. And these people can end up completely ruined. And we've probably seen, you may know people, or the audience may know people like this, and it certainly happens.
Yeah, I've known some people out of the burner culture to go down that road too.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into the open conspiracy.
Okay, yeah, I'll just read just a brief, not this whole thing, but again, H.G. Wells' great book, The Open Conspiracy, which is kind of what this is in a certain way, but just quote, "The open conspiracy is necessarily opposed to all such implacable loyalties, and still more such so to the aggressive assertion and propaganda of such loyalties. When these things take the form of suppressing reasonable," okay, we'll read the whole thing, but basically he's saying anybody who has loyalty to king and country is treasonous to mankind. Anybody who has a tradition, anybody who, there is little to no effort to restrain the aggressive nationalist when he waves his flag against the welfare of our race, and our race meaning the global superstate, right? So he talks very plainly about removing all the boundaries and doing this through education, but destroying tradition, destroying nationhood, destroying identity, destroying family in the interest of world peace. Okay, open conspiracy is supposed to end war. Thank you. Okay.
The next, I almost gave it up. The next psychopath, Bertrand Russell.
Yep. Diets, injections, and injunctions will, a nice alliteration. Diets, injections, and injunctions will combine from an early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable. And any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. Even if all are miserable, all will believe themselves happy because the government will tell them they are so. And let me just...
I had somebody argue with me one time that Bertrand Russell wasn't a part of all this.
Yeah, and he was a lefty, and that's one of those things where this book, you wonder if this is being written. It's kind of, you look at the same thing with Huxley. Is he a critic, or is he just laying out?
I mean, Huxley, it's clear that he's an architect, and I've got so much data on him. But Bertrand Russell actually worked with Aldous Huxley, Alfred North Whitehead, B.F. Skinner, Kurt Gödel. He's involved in the Fabian Society, which, of course, Aldous Huxley was a Fabian. He's associated with I.A. Richards, which we discussed about last episode. George Santayana. He's all over this stuff. The New School for Social Research. He was actually one of the people going back to what was it, episode 2 or so, regarding the creation of the peace sign. And that was also influenced by Anton LaVey and Guido von List.
Yeah, so there you go. That was kind of thrown out there for people that are like, "Oh, this is my hero." So here's the evidence. Draw your own conclusions. But anyways, so just one thing that I wanted to foreground though is that if you look at it in a sense, if you unpack this a little bit, any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. That means your rebellion is actually leading you to greater servitude.
Well, and this is exactly what the whole point of the term conspiracy theorist is, because then it's to psychologically attack you so that you don't stand up and speak out about stuff that's going on, and they're just going to categorize anything that exposes the government, MKUltra, the CIA, the military intelligence community, etc., as conspiracy theory, and then they already have an attack on you just for starting out. It's just like when I started exposing Gordon Wasson. It didn't matter that I had all of the documents there, all of these professors, etc., that I had worked with for years. They all started attacking me just based on the idea, and they refused to ever address the work. They refused to ever address the citations.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, you do have these cognitive dissonance barriers that prevent from actually perceiving the reality of the situation. So that's why it's so easy to misdirect people. But a lot of times they're willfully self-misdirected. And by the way, that program is MK Often, which was Gordon Thomas talked about it, Secrets and Lies. Quote, CIA's Operation Often was initiated by the chiefs of the CIA's Technical Service Branch, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, quote, to explore the world of black magic, to harness the forces of darkness, and challenge the concept that the inner reaches of the mind are beyond reach. As part of Operation Often, Dr. Gottlieb and other CIA employees visited with and recruited fortune tellers, palm readers, clairvoyants, astrologers, mediums, psychics, specialists in demonology, witches and warlocks, Satanists, other occult practitioners, and more. And there you go, Operation Often. And if you tie that into the Finders cult and the Process Church, you get some very dark and pretty disturbing stuff. But if you look at the occult stuff in The Rock, then it starts even to be even more disturbing, or perhaps more edifying. But
depending on which side you're playing for or whatever.
Yep.
All right, so let's see, strategic payload concepts.
So when I reviewed that, the PsyOps kind of operations paradigm, it's very, again, it kind of looks like a product marketing thing. But let's look a little bit at some of these quote unquote non-lethal weapons. Defense Science Board Task Force on Future Strategic Strike Forces. This is a little description of what these weapons are. Quote, non-lethal effects directed at the physiological or psychological functions of specific individuals or the population. Applications of biological, chemical, or electromagnetic radiation effects on humans should be pursued. R&D into sophisticated psychological operations designed to change the mind of individuals or the population is needed. Techniques could include the projection of sounds and images to specific points in space. The Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Program Directorate should broaden its tactical and operational focus to consider the strategic applications and associated treaty issues of non-lethal weapons. And I have a little thing of some different kinds of strategic payload, commutives, purpose, neutralize individuals, directed energy, dissuade psychological operations. And this has, I don't know if you want me to read through that, but this just shows.
You can hit some of those bullet points there. I can help you, whatever.
Yeah. Okay, commutives. Commutives might be considered to deal with otherwise difficult situations in which neutralizing individuals could enable ultimate mission success. Effectiveness, the principal technical issue is the balance between effectiveness, i.e. the targets are truly calmed, and margin of safety, avoiding overexposure resulting in fatalities of neutral bystanders. The treaty implications are significant. Directed energy weapons. Lasers or high-powered microwaves providing effective, less than lethal capability against dismounts. Not sure what that is, but the HPM approach termed active denial may be used to produce an automatic burning response in a targeted individual. Laser devices may be used at low power to dazzle eyesight or burn skins or objects. Okay, and then we have psychological operations. Manipulate, in the near term, we have the ability to manipulate speech, audio, and still and video images. In the midterm, we could pursue such capabilities as directed audio beams. In the far term, we could pursue such capabilities such as holograms that could remotely project an image into a room.
And just really quickly, that word dismounts, it means those who would be attacking via horse, essentially. They're getting off the horse to come whack your ass.
Okay. Well, there we go. Dismounts. Okay. Let's just continue here. This is a quote from Robert J. Grimm. Quote, neuroscientists will be under increasing pressure to examine their individual and collective positions vis-a-vis the widening issue of brain control application in a democratic society. We cannot escape this responsibility. And this is brain control in a democratic society. So brain control and democratic society don't quite fit together there. But obviously, there are a lot of ethical issues. There are a lot of scientists who are doing pure research that aren't necessarily aware of their applications. But there's certainly voices about this. And I have like 50 pages of different quotes on this, so just giving a few. This is a very important one. This is from Edgar H. Schein, because this describes how you remove someone from their normal social environment. Okay. Quote, in order to produce marked changes of behavior and or attitude, it is necessary to weaken, undermine, or remove the old patterns of behavior and the old attitudes. This can be done either by removing the individual physically and preventing any communication with those he cares about, or proving to him that those whom he respects are not worthy of it, and indeed should be actively mistrusted. If at the same time, the total environment inflexibly provides rewards and punishments only in terms of the new behavior and attitudes to be contained and provides new contexts around which to build up relationships, it is highly likely that the new desired new behavior and attitudes will be learned. Okay. So does that kind of sound like, casting off all your family and friends or your society to join a group, a cult, right, or whatever? Yeah. And this is talking about professor of organizational society. He's talking about correctional therapy, but obviously I think has much wider implications for social research. And that's from 1962, so it's quite old. So a few more examples. I think I have the next. And this is from PACE. It's like some committee for clean energy, and they had this report, which I'll give you the exact thing. I had to type all this crap in, but this is from their report on certain types of weapons. Quote, Liechtenstein also reported that the Soviet scientists have developed and fitted a theory to the actual brainwave measurements and could insert material on electromagnetic carriers directly into the brain and could control whether or not the process stimulated conscious awareness of the individual. Quote, the monitoring of time coherent and phase-locked psychoactive modulation suggests the following. The psychoactive modulation effectively locks in the multiple carrier frequencies, say 11 to 23. On these locked-in multi-channels, brain-coded information is inserted, feeding it directly into the captured target brains. Quote, potentially almost anything can be inserted in the target brain-mind systems, and such insertions would be processed by the biosystems as intracranially generated data effects. Words, phrases, images, sensations, and emotions could be directly inserted and experienced in the biological targets as internal states, moods, emotions, and thoughts. Okay, so again, when you talk about going to a rave, it may be just a little bit more than just having a good time and pumping your fist in the air.
And with a glow stick.
Yeah. Oh God, I hate glow sticks. No, I love glow sticks. Why do I? Okay. And just real quick, I'll just say this is another quote. I'll send you this one. Over the past years, U.S. researchers have confirmed the possibility of affecting the function of the NS nervous system by weak EMF, electromagnetic fields. As was previously said by Soviet researchers, EMF may cause acoustic hallucination and reduce the sensitivity of humans and animals to other stimuli. Let me read that again. May cause acoustic hallucination, quote, radio sound, and reduce the sensitivity of humans and animals to some other stimuli, to change the activity of the brain, especially the hypothalamus and the cortex, to break the formation, processing, and information storage in the brain. Again, to break the processes of formation, processing, and information storage in the brain. These non-specific changes in the CNS, central nervous system, can serve as a basis for studying the possibilities of the direct influence of EMFs on specific functions. And so lots of things about that, and they're even talking about using this on entire cities and large-scale population centers through phase array technologies. But that sort of sounds like a lot we talked about, doesn't it, in terms of breaking down your ability to formulate thoughts, your ability to receive other types of stimulation. But let's just dive in here. And I apologize to anybody if I make any gaffes reading these quotes, but I'm doing the high speed chase. My DMT is wearing off.
Back with the DMT. Yeah.
Nah. Okay. So let's move now to Mr. John Lilly. So John Lilly was connected with the Brain Research Institute. Jan, you have that slide if you want to chime in on anybody on there.
Well, is that, I presume the first one there is Dr. Jolyon West, who it's got him New York Times CIA behavior control experiments.
Yeah.
But Jolyon West also worked directly with Aldous Huxley, etc. He even stayed at Huxley's house during MK Ultra research. And then Lilly, I'm not sure if I have Dr. Sweet in the brain. Some of these I may have in there and just not recognize. But
Dr.
Sweet.
Frey, microwave hearing. Have you heard of Dr. Frey?
I'm not sure. I've got nope. Doesn't look like Dr. Frey in there. Let me see if I have Dr. Sweet in here though. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off. No Dr. Sweet either. But West is the infamous son of a bitch who killed the world's largest elephant at the time with a massive dose of LSD. It was like 100,000, or no, it was like 1 million micrograms or something like that. But he injected Tusco, the world's largest elephant at the time, with LSD, and the poor elephant just keeled right over.
Yeah, and I was, looking at these guys. I mean, especially West, Jolly. What a great name! Yeah, these are all connected.
Well,
but
his real name is Louis Jolyon West, but
yeah, he goes. People call him Jolly, but anyways,
right.
These are just to show that that John Lilly was part of this Brain Research Institute. In fact, the book I was looking through where I'm going to get to in a second. He looked where he got all his funding from. He was various naval things. Now Lilly, I'll say a little bit more about Lilly, and possibly he was getting cold feet about some of the stuff. But anyways, so the Brain Research Institute. This just lists from their third annual report. They basically were one of those organizations with quasi-governmental funding that was doing a lot of this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's classified. There's also a lot of stuff that's public domain. But the Brain Research Institute, I think, is kind of an interesting meeting point of a lot of these different people. And John Lilly, again, I think is quite important for the whole thing we've talked about. Just to go all the way back to 1934, just to say this stuff has been going on for a long time. This is a paper, quote, "A method for the remote control of electrical stimulation of the nervous system." Yale Journal of Biology, 1934. Wow. Anyways, and a few other quotes here just showing the roots of this stuff and these guys. This is a quote in 1942 at a meeting sponsored by the Josiah Macy Foundations in New York. Arturo Rosenblatt presented the idea that would appear in the following year in the Philosophy of Science paper. Okay. In addition, the audience was Dr. Warren McCullough, University of Illinois Medical School, long been interested in the organization of the cortex of the brain. McCullough, a neurophysiologist, had already begun working with Walter Pitts on a mathematical description of certain types of neural behavior. In 1943, the same year, the Rosenbluth-Weisner-Bigelow paper would appear. McCullough and Pitts would publish a logical calculus of the ideas eminent in nervous activity in the Journal of Mathematical Biophysics. The paper goes on to describe a logical calculus and principles for constructing a class of computing machines that would permit the embodiment of any theory of mind or behavior. Their publication could well be taken as the birth of explicit cybernetics. So we have to see here, though, with cybernetics, we're looking not only as trying to map the mind into a computer, but actually mapping the mind as a computer and manipulating it directly. So this cybernetic activity, or even biotics, which obviously became known as the bionic man and all that. But cybernetics is positing the human mind is like a computer and manipulating it. So this is some of the earliest research that Lilly expanded in a lot of detail.
And of course, I just want to mention that the Josiah Macy conferences, or the Macy Foundation, the Macy conferences, etc., were key to MK Ultra. They included people like Aldous Huxley, Arturo Rosenbluth, Abram Hoffer, Harold Abramson, Humphrey Osmond, Gregory Bateson, John von Neumann, Margaret Mead, Norbert Wiener, Oscar Janiger, Sidney Cohen, etc. So these are essentially the top people behind the CIA's mind control ultra program.
Yeah. And the next quote here, back in 1970, Congressman James Sherr commented that, quote, as a result of spinoffs from medical, military, aerospace, and industrial research, we are now in the process of developing devices and products capable of controlling violent mobs without injury. We can tranquilize, impede, immobilize, harass, shock, upset, stupefy, nauseate, chill, temporarily blind, deafen, or just plain scare the wits out of anyone that the police have a proper need to control and restrain. The 1972 Security Planning Corporation report on non-lethal weapons to the National Science Foundation listed 34 types using electrical, optical, acoustic, thermal, kinetic impact, chemical irritant, and barrier devices to produce control effects. Any of us might become future targets, since in reality these weapons will form part of the future's technology of political control. But I think they're already in the present. So that's just a background. And again, I could give hundreds of patents and all kinds of stuff, but that should just give people a sense that I'm not just pulling this out of my my arse, to use an English term.
Your rabbit's hat.
My rabbit's hat. So just let's
All
look.
right. So John Cunningham Lilly, born January 6, 1915, lived to September 30, American physician, neuroscientist, psychoanalyst, psychonaut, philosopher, writer, and inventor. And anyway, you want to follow up from there?
Yeah. So John Lilly, very famous in a certain way for being the character that Altered States was based off of. So Altered States was based off of Lilly's flotation tank experiments. His father was Richard Coyle Lilly, president of the First National Bank of St. Paul, very rich banking family. And in fact, his family did want him to go into banking.
So what you're claiming here is that another banking family outside of the Morgans and, who was, what's his name from Millbrook? Billy, what's his name? So the Lilly family, they were another banking family. The Mellon family was Millbrook. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. The Lilly family was a very prominent banking family. And so that was a little source of contention.
I'm shocked. Not really.
I am too. So John Lilly, just to a little more background, he's famous. He actually began doing a lot of research, cutting apart monkey brains, finding electrical, stimulal, intracranial implants, things like that. The one thing about Lilly, though, I will say that was sort of admirable is he always believed that if experiments he couldn't do on other people, he would do on himself. So early on, he was working on some kind of synthetic human protein and ended up, having severe health consequences because he didn't eat any protein. And, he did take tremendous amounts of psychedelic substances. Eventually, living off a ketamine drip and communicating with aliens. He had a ketamine drip in a wheelchair. He spoke at one of my friends' college graduation ceremonies, and he was just absolutely fried by the end of his life. But that being said, Lilly's mentor was a guy named JBS Haldane.
Well, this is the famous John Haldane that Terence McKenna altered his quote. It's the world isn't as strange as or as strange as you suppose. It's much stranger than you suppose, or whatever. But that's John Haldane. He was another major eugenicist.
Yeah, genetic linkage, Mendelian genetics, natural selection, abiogenesis. He worked on different types of viruses. He looked at he was famous. He was also socialist, Marxist, atheist, and humanist. But he was a big influence on John Lilly. In fact, John Lilly was very much. He talked about a limit on the speed. He talked interested in evolution, but certainly eugenics is there. Big time eugenics, and certainly linked with all the same Fabian people as well.
Well, and let me just add to his background here a little bit. Again, he was, and I mean, you can never go almost more than one or two steps before you run into this idiot. But he was buddies with Aldous Huxley, Also, he signed the Eugenics Manifesto together with Julian Huxley and Theodosius Dobzhansky. Excuse me. Theodosius Dobzhansky's daughter, Sophie Dobzhansky, married Professor Michael Coe, who invented the 2012 nonsense, right? So, and then, he was a winner of the Darwin Award. He heavily influenced Brave New World. Again, Eugenics Manifesto heavily influenced Terence McKenna, etc. So this is the center of the BS. These guys here.
Yeah, and Lily's his office. The guy next door to his office was I'm forgetting his name now. Was someone in Project Artichoke. At one point, he got a lot of funding from various agencies.
That was a precursor to MK Ultra, Artichoke, and Bluebird.
And supposedly Lilly did have some compunction about how his research was being used, and he lost funding. But that being said,
well, I mean, yeah, that's why he joined the Communist Party, and he was. I know that's John B.S. Haldane. Excuse me, so I have to go back to Lilly. Scratch that, folks.
Okay, well, let's just dive into Lilly, because this is something that, this could be an entire thing on itself. But his book, Programming and Metaprogramming the Human Biocomputer, is really a sort of a manifesto and a model of utilizing a combination of all these different maps. We're looking at the cybernetic model, sort of the mechanistic computerized model, a depth psychological model. You have the inner screen of Lacan. You have archetypal energies. You have an understanding of Llewellyn's psychological field theory, all being put into one package. That
I think you mean Kurt Lewin, right?
Kurt Lewin, yeah. What
okay.
I say?
You said Llewellyn, so I think you said that in part 6 a few times too, Llewellyn. That's all right. So now people know it's actually Kurt Lewin. Go ahead.
Sometimes the brain gets tired. But anyways.
Yeah.
But so this work, the human biocomputer. So first of all, you're looking at the computer as a mind, but he's doing using altered states, flotation tanks, lots of LSD and stuff like that to map the mind and also to create different types of programming. And in a certain way, I do feel that it is a pretty advanced model of consciousness. So let me just read through a little bit of some of the notes I took from his book. Metaprograms. Essentially, metaprogramming is an operation in which a central control system controls hundreds of thousands of programs. So if you look at some type of small functioning that we have in our minds, a metaprogram is like a master program that is usually completely invisible and hidden from conscious awareness. And these metaprograms will control many, many other types of behavior, perception, and everything like that. So he's working on a psychobiological model of consciousness, looking at both the biology of the brain, looking at all the neuroscience stuff, as he was very adept in that, but also very much going into inner space, talking about doing, the blank screen, dissolving the self, the bunch of Leary stuff, but a much more sort of scientifically grounded basis. He describes the I, the individual I, is a metaprogram. There's also super self metaprograms like your higher self. So he's basically saying that all of these things, whether it's even experience of some kind of God or divinity, can be seen as a type of a metaprogram that's unconscious. Your I is a metaprogram that binds together many, many other subprograms and even other metaprograms. But Lilly says that, quote, in the province of the mind, what one believes to be true or becomes true within certain limits to be found experimentally and experientially. These limits are further beliefs to be transcended. In the mind, there are no limits. So what one believes to be true or becomes true. So basically he's saying that we create our own reality, but he's really looking at completely rewiring our mind-body perceptions and using a very systematic procedure. And again, this is discussed in a way that, you create a self-help sort of metaprogram that helps you develop, but it's a pretty detailed way for actually, if you look at, say, something like, the Project Monarch or something like that, you could see this sort of feeding into something like Monarch. So especially if people are taking lots of drugs, you can see this as a way to install particular types of programs through, again, a very well-researched model. He talks about manipulation of the genetic code. There's genetic bases that are in the brain, personality predispositions, how to work with those, how to transform those or subvert those. Quote, the human computer has stored program properties. That means there's inherent, sort of hardwired belief systems or other types of behaviors. But basically you can have stored programs, just as if on my computer I have a program that I never opened. That program is there. It could be operating behind the threshold, like a system virus you're not aware of. The human, quote, the human computer within limits yet to be defined has self-programming properties and other person's programming properties. That means other people can program this mind, right? So this, again, this is a model based on using LSD primarily, and he describes LSD as a reprogramming substance. So this is a reprogramming substance to install meta programs, invisible, subconscious reality filters that can completely transform a person's life. A little more from Lilly. Metaprogramming is considered a more inclusive term than suggestibility. Metaprogrammers consider sources, inputs, outputs, and central processes more than just the end result of the process, right? So it's not as blunt as hooking an electrode up to a monkey or beating someone if they don't eat their pudding or something like that. But it's much more subtle and also refers to, again, a combination of all those psychological things that I went through in the last part. Quote, certain substances have programmatic and or metaprogrammic effects, i.e. they change the operations of the computer, some at the programmatic level, some at the metaprogrammic level. So he's talking about use of substances that change the operational activities of psychological states. Where, however you want to define those, we're talking about, whether they're types of personal history, gender, whatever. There's certain things that are deeper, certain things that are more superficial. He gives, examples: LSD, mescaline, alcohol, ganja are reprogramming substances. And he said metaprogramming can hide, repress certain types of storage material. That means it can hide or repress memories. It can hide or repress even things directly in your own experience. It can hide or repress things that are operating below your subconscious threshold that are influencing your behavior and your life. And this is something where you can see people always, end up in the same type of relationship. They seem to have certain types of issues in their life. They have weird emotional outbursts. These, Lilly say, could be part of metaprograms that are also obscuring certain types of quote-unquote storage material, which has been implanted in the brain. And then, quote, the seeds of the destruction of self can be buried in the deeper metaprograms and programs of one's computer. Certain types of neuronal activity can destroy an individual. So it's very possible to implant self-destruct metaprograms in the human biocomputer. And again, Lilly conducted very detailed research using LSD on himself and other participants. It was funded. I can give the whole list of the people that funded this research, but there was a whole array of people that funded this. And the last thing about Lilly, John Lilly developed a Lilly wave. It's a new electrical waveform to balance a current. It moves in one direction, then it moves in another direction. This allows people to be exposed to basically types of mental stimulation. For example, if you're blasting someone with an ELF frequency, at a certain point, they're going to have a major negative reaction, or they may, it may actually damage them, or they may have an aversion response. With the Lilly wave, you alternate these currents. So you give, you alternate the direction that these frequencies are coming in the brain, and then the brain will naturally train with it. It can actually take much higher potentialities of these types of brain waves. And these are like stimulating neurons, waveform of stimulating current, pulse pairs of current residing from quasi-differentiation with passive electrical elements of rectangular pulse, etc. But not to get into all that, but this is where people talked about a lot of the stuff of, you know, if you're talking about cell tower stuff or whatever, this is where you can have a constant frequency going that normally people would have major reactions to, right? Or just know what and say what's going to happen here. And this allows it to, you can basically amp it up over time and increase the dose without this initial reaction, physiological reaction, but still have the same psychological function.
All right. So that brings us to the end of part 7 and the end of this series. Again, you and I were discussing doing a separate one just on FM radio. So again, we apologize for pushing that back and back and back, etc. And we're going to try to get something out on the War of the Worlds by October 30th, of course, which is the anniversary for that. One thing that I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, is although we've given you 14, 15 hours of video podcasts plus the 5 radio shows in this series, this is just an introduction. And, you know, really people need to take each one of the citations that we've provided in this series and research them out, acquire the books, read the books, study the people behind the books. And we're not talking about some easy undertaking that's going to take you a weekend. It's going to take most people a few years to go through all of this material. But if you want to know how it works, I suppose really the only way that you can protect yourself from all of this stuff is to know it.
Yeah, and also, you know, things are written, they're written in a way that prevents people from reading them, right? So if you have, you know, if you're not used to reading you know, more, you know, what do you call
technical data versus
technical
a novel
data and
right.
citations, and it can be kind of annoying to try to get through stuff. And also, there are points where people will obscure their meaning through very elaborate words. And I'll tell you, I was surprised at Huxley's speech. Reading that again, he's really not using. He doesn't seem like that, you know, highly articulate intellectual. And that's,
well, you know, but you know, and I get attacked all the time from people who think, oh, you know, Jan Everin, you can't trust him. He actually thinks Aldous Huxley was part of MK Ultra. You know, but there's, I mean, it's like the old saying, all roads lead to Rome. When it comes to MK Ultra mind control research, nearly all roads lead to Aldous Huxley. And, you know, he constantly comes up, and originally I thought that Gordon Wasson was a key player until I really started focusing on Huxley, and then Huxley really became a far more predominant MK Ultra stage manager than Gordon Wasson was.
Yeah, but you know, it's to see the depth of this, right? I mean, you start seeing that. But first of all, the other thing is that if everything that they're doing totally worked perfectly, you know, we'd all be complete robotic zombies. So obviously there's a lot of resilience, but that does not mean...
Well, next time you walk past somebody tattooed head to toe with earplugs and a plug in their lower lip, you tell me that it's not working.
Yeah. But dude, you put in some clips from that techno, that EMD, like major purveyor, just watching that and just... I mean, even just watching the video clips, I'm like, man, if you're at one of those events, I mean, when you're going there, they're running all the testing on you, and you can even see direct parallels, you know, between the stuff we talked about and what goes on in these various environments. You know? And
you know, we can't forget Burning Man. Burning Man is, and this other rave that you just mentioned. These are the apex, ladies and gentlemen, of these psychological warfare, mind control techniques. So when you go to Burning Man, the reason why the FBI and the CIA and Army Intel and this group and that, they're studying you, you know, and they are keeping close. And not only that, the whole Burning Man is on a damn army base. I mean, how much more obvious can you get? But they're studying you. You need to wake up. You need to study this. See it in the larger picture. It's not just, Jan Irvin and Dr. Hans Utter are crazy. There's actually a lot of research here, and you can ignore it or you can wake up and disconnect from it. And we hope you do the later. And anyway, did you have anything that you wanted to add, Hans?
I think that's it. Again, I kind of blasted through all that material, so excuse any misplaced words. But yeah, it's been great. And people that, take charge of your life and respect music in a sense of listen to music that's challenging, that's good. Obviously, I'm not saying every form of popular music is bad, but there's a lot of stuff you can look at these movements and say, hey, wait, what's going on here?
Yeah. And at least pay attention to the lyrics, pay attention to the music and what it's doing to you and how quickly it gets you in a trance and you're tapping along and all this stuff. And if the lyrics are very clearly, giving you subliminal messages like don't fear the reaper, to have wild sex like, Keisha and fornicate with animals and stuff like that. I mean, this is material to degrade you, to break you down and your family down, and just realize it and disconnect from it. You don't need it, and people ask me, have I disconnected from most of the music in my life? And I have, and I will play classical in the car sometimes now. But, all of the pop music that I used to be into, all the rock, all of that stuff, the Grateful Dead, the techno and trance, I used to be into all of that stuff. Tool, I've disconnected from all of it, and I mean, yeah, you might think it's so great and wonderful and these bands and all, but try it for a few months without. You'll be all right. You'll make it. I promise.
Yeah, and then you can start listening to other stuff, because one thing...
And without all that frickin' pop music, you'll have time to study all of the notes we've given you here, folks.
Yeah. But just one thing to mention is that, even you're watching some of these videos, if you look at this idea of creating these meta programs in the mind, it's possible that these things can be feeding subconscious networks that are kind of implanted or programmed there, especially in like a large scale event like a rave. So I don't know how advanced this stuff is, but I'm just saying that here's some of the research that's happened. So
absolutely. All right. Well, it sounds like there's your calling, and I think that's a wrap. So Hans, thank you so much, and we'll follow up for FM radio soon, I hope.
All right, Jan. Take care, brother.
All right, you too. All right.
Keep listening to Jay-Z. No. That guy sucks. By the way, I'm just saying right now, Jay-Z sucks, okay? You listen to Jay-Z, you deserve to be mind controlled. All right.
All right. Take care. Bye.